Okay, so let's talk about one of the most unbelievable stories you'll ever hear. Back in 1914, Sir Ernest Shackleton and his crew set out on a ship called Endurance. They were chasing a legendary goal, something no one had ever done, and their journey, well, it became the gold standard for survival stories. But what makes it so powerful isn't just that they survived, it's that they survived a catastrophic total failure. And that's really the heart of it. Before this became a tale of heroism, it was, by any and every measure, a complete and utter failure. Their mission didn't just hit a snag, it blew up on the launch pad. It became absolutely, fundamentally impossible. And yet, that's where the magic is. It's right in the ashes of that spectacular failure that this story becomes a legend. It's maybe the ultimate example of how the worst possible situation can reveal the very best of human spirit, leadership, and, well, endurance. So to really appreciate what they went through, you have to understand the dream they were chasing. I mean, just picture the time. We're talking no GPS, no Gore-Tex, no satellite phones. If you got in trouble, that was it. There was no calling for help. It was just them, a wooden ship, and an entire continent of ice. And the plan itself was just breathtakingly ambitious. The goal? To be the first to ever cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. They were going to land, trek almost 3,000 kilometers in temperatures that would make your teeth hurt, cross the South Pole, and meet another ship waiting on the far side. And they budgeted just 120 days to do it all. Simple, right? What a plan. But, as they say, Antarctica makes its own plans. Even after local whalers warned them that the ice in the Weddell Sea was the worst they'd seen in years, Shackleton, ever the optimist, pushed forward. And that's when the dream began to turn into a nightmare. They were so close, agonizingly close, just about a day's sail from where they needed to land. But then, the pack ice, this giant, shifting jigsaw puzzle of ice, just closed in around them like a fist. They tried everything, running the engines full throttle for hours, but it was no use. The ship couldn't move an inch. They were completely, totally trapped. So now, they're just drifting. Weeks slowly bleed into months. The Antarctic winter arrives, plunging them into 24-hour darkness. And all the while, the ice is squeezing the ship. The sounds were apparently terrifying, the huge wooden timbers of the ship groaning and cracking under millions of tons of pressure. Hope was starting to run out. For 9 long months, the ice held them in its grip. Then, finally, the ship's hull just gave way. It splintered. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and the men just had to stand there on the ice and watch in silence as the Endurance, their home, their only connection to the world they knew, was crushed and slowly swallowed by the sea. They were now 28 men, completely alone on a floating piece of ice. At that moment, the great expedition was officially over. A new mission had begun, and it had only one goal: survive. This is where the next chapter starts. This long, terrifying drift on a giant, unstable ice floe hundreds and hundreds of miles from anything you could call land. 497. I just want you to let that number sink in. That's how many days passed from the moment their ship got stuck in the ice until they finally set foot on solid ground again. That is over 16 months of pure survival mode. So how does a group of 28 men not descend into chaos in a situation like that? Well, it really boils down to leadership. Shackleton was a genius at managing people. He created strict daily routines so that despair couldn't set in, everyone had a job, everyone got the same amount of food, and he led by example. He ordered every man to dump their personal gear, keeping only 2 pounds. Then he himself took out his gold coins and a Bible and left them in the snow, sending a powerful message. The only thing that has any value out here is each other. After months of drifting, the ice floe they were living on started to break apart beneath their feet. They had to scramble into 3 small, open lifeboats. After a truly miserable week on the freezing ocean, they made it. They landed on the shores of a desolate, windswept rock called Elephant Island. They were on land, which was great, but they were still completely stranded, and their journey was nowhere near over. From Elephant Island, the options were grim. Option A, a shorter trip to Cape Horn, but it meant going right through the Drake Passage, maybe the most violent stretch of ocean on the entire planet. Shackleton looked at the map, looked at the sky, and chose option B. It was a much longer journey, 1,300 kilometers, to the whaling stations on South Georgia. The logic? The winds and currents were slightly more in their favor. It was a choice between almost impossible and slightly less impossible. So the plan was basically a suicide mission. Shackleton and 5 of his toughest men would get in one of the tiny 22-foot lifeboats and try to cross 1,300 kilometers of the Southern Ocean to find help. The other 22 men? They would just have to wait on that barren island and hope. And unbelievably, they did it. For 16 days, they were battered by hurricane-force winds and waves the size of buildings. But they made it to South Georgia. But then comes this final brutal twist. They landed on the wrong side of the island, and between them and the safety of the whaling station was a 10,000-foot glacier-covered mountain range that no human had ever crossed before. They had no choice. Shackleton and 2 of the other men, completely exhausted, frostbitten, just started climbing. For 36 hours straight, they hiked, with no real equipment, over those impassable mountains and literally stumbled into the whaling station. They had found help. But the story's not over. Because you've got to ask, what about the other 22 men? They were left behind, huddled under overturned boats, their food running out, with absolutely no idea if Shackleton had survived or if they'd been left to die. Well, back on Elephant Island, Shackleton's second-in-command, a man named Frank Wild, refused to let the men give up. Every single morning, he would get everyone up with the exact same words. "Pack your gear, boys. The boss may come today." He did this for 128 days. Think about that. For 4 months of bitter cold, starvation, and crushing uncertainty, Frank Wild kept that routine. He kept his men ready, kept their hope from being extinguished, all based on his faith that his leader would not abandon them. So let's remember the number that this all started with: 28 men. They set out almost 2 years earlier with this grand ambition to conquer a continent. On August 30th, 1916, after 3 other rescue attempts had been blocked by ice, Shackleton finally got a ship through. And as he got closer to Elephant Island, he scanned the beach with his binoculars, counting the tiny figures huddled there. And against every possible odd, all 22 were there. They were all alive. Not a single man was lost. You know, their ship was called Endurance. In the end, they lost the ship, but its name became the perfect word to describe the crew. It's the ability to withstand hardship without giving way. And that's exactly what they did. And I think that's the question this whole story leaves you with. What are the real limits of our resilience? Shackleton's story seems to suggest that maybe it has very little to do with success or failure, and everything to do with a stubborn, absolute refusal to give up on each other.